Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vice President. Thank you very much for the very kind words of introduction. So now you have a look, hopefully, at my slides. I'm very grateful for this opportunity. I'm very grateful for receiving the honor to talk on this occasion on a topic that really concerns the prosperity of Europe, but also global prosperity. Europe has set itself a new growth paradigm. The European Green Deal has announced that it will combine green growth with prosperity, economic growth with combating climate change. And as the chairman already indicated, it is not a matter where multilateral cooperation is nice to have. It's rather indispensable. And the next 6 slides will try to make that case and to elaborate on this insight a little bit. I will have 3 parts to my introductory remarks. I'll rather talk a little bit in the beginning about what I think would be a rational approach to EU climate policy, which to some extent the EU has been pursuing for quite some time. And there are still some very important parts missing to really form a coherent, rational climate policy approach. Then I would like to take the opportunity to talk about the implications of the European Green Deal. The European Green Deal is especially announcing higher climate ambitions, climate neutrality, to reach climate neutrality by the middle of the century. And this increased level of ambition, as much as it is to be welcomed, also implies that the policy decisions to be made are more urgent, more to be speeded up. And in the end, the third part, I will try to pick out one particular topic that is of much interest in the moment. It's highly discussed, highly debated in Europe, and it should be an issue for the global discussion, which is carbon leakage and the possibility to avoid carbon leakage by introducing mechanisms like a border carbon adjustment. And I'm sure in the discussion there will be many occasions or many aspects that we can talk about more deeply. Setting the scene, I think it's wise to look at the development of carbon emissions, of climate gas emissions over the last few decades. And you see, while the world has been freeing itself to a great extent from the burden of poverty, especially starting in 1990, with hundreds of millions of people leaving poverty, it was also a period where climate gas emissions were accelerating. And you see that at the global scale, they only know one movement, one direction, namely to upwards. What we see here is that Europe, which you see in blue, Germany is singled out in dark blue, so you see the bottom of the picture. Europe is responsible for roughly 10% of global emissions. Now, the association, which we won't discuss today, I think it's just a consensus, a scientific consensus, that climate change is to a good extent, to a large extent, man-made. It's anthropogenic climate change, and it's mainly a reflection of the high climate gas emissions. So in order to reduce or to combat climate change, to halt and dampen global warming, we need to reduce the use of fossil fuels very quickly towards zero, to at least in the net balancing of emissions, negative and positive emissions, we need to reduce climate gas emissions at the global scale. Now, from a perspective of a policy-making entity such as the European Union, it's clear that you should approach this problem at the highest level, at least setting the regulation governing and coordinating the individual actions underneath. You should get as high as possible. Why? Because if you were just able to find the best solution for the world, then you would say, well, please consider the principle of division of labor also for the task at hand, namely reducing climate emissions. You should avoid the next ton of climate gas emissions where it is cheapest to avoid, basically harvesting the low-hanging fruits first, work on technical progress in the meantime, hoping and expecting that better possibilities to avoid emissions on other places where it's still very costly will become available, making avoidance cheaper and cheaper over time, and working towards climate neutrality in the most inexpensive fashion. That would be what a global planning entity would advise, which is of course not in existence. Ultimately, we need to have all efforts feed into an approach that is a global approach to fight global warming, since of course the atmosphere as a place to deposit climate gas emissions is a global public good. So we need a global approach, but let's talk about what policy-making entities like the EU can do, and then talk about the implications for its collaboration, for its coordination with other big economic regions, such as and economies, such as the US, for example. There are strong arguments for proceeding by setting a uniform carbon price for the coordination of all the individual consumption and investment decisions that need to be taken in order to avoid emissions, in order to avoid the use of fossil fuels, and in order to transform the energy systems into carbon neutral energy systems. Why is that? Because if you think about the principle of division of labor in the sense of harvesting the low-hanging fruits in terms of cheapest possibilities to avoid emissions first, you have basically two approaches. One approach would be you really make a detailed plan and implement it by command and control methods via government regulation. This is really not a very good approach in its pure form, since we don't know so little about the individual preferences, individual possibilities of the myriad of consumers and investors making up our modern economies. But we have a good coordination device, which is called the market. So if we could create a market for emissions, set a price as a coordination signal, we could implement this idea of following the principle of division of labor most closely, which has two advantages. First, it would coordinate the myriad of individual actions toward the right goal, namely emission reduction, toward climate neutrality at the lowest possible cost, reaching this objective at the lowest possible cost. And along the way, it would also reveal information, because we know so little about several of the sectors that are involved. We know very much what the costs are in terms of avoiding emissions in the electricity generating sector. We know quite well what it is in several parts of industry, because we have tried out different pricing solutions already and we have seen the reactions. But we know very little about those sectors like heating, like mobility, where that involves very many individual decisions, household decisions, and we don't really know about preferences, about possibilities to avoid emissions, about substitution for example, fossil-fueled car mobility. So by implementing a pricing system and working towards carbon neutrality in this decentralized coordination by a market, we would also reveal information. Now, this has important implications. This insight has important implications. And I don't have to point you very intensely, I just briefly mentioned it, at the very fact that planned economies really, by and large, have failed. So a detailed state-planned climate transition, energy transition is likely to fail as well. So we need a decentralized coordination device. We need markets to steer the transformation. This has important implications, which are not perfectly understood, also in Europe are not perfectly understood. The overall objective should be away from transformation away from fossil fuels towards renewable resources, energy efficiency, low emissions, So there needs only to be one overarching objective, which is climate gas reduction over time towards climate neutrality. Now we have a system in Europe where for roughly, not quite, but roughly half of the economy, half of the emissions, namely for industry and the energy sector, we have a uniform pricing by having implemented European emission trading system, the European EU ETS. We have other sectors where we have individual targets, which is unfortunate. But irrespective of whatever you do, whatever regime you implement, there will be distributional consequences. So you need to take care that at the national level, at the EU level, and also for globally coordinated solutions, you need to ascertain that the burden sharing is negotiated and is clearly talked about in the outset, because there will always be distributional consequences of moving from one energy system, which is working well, but has detrimental implications for the environment, to another energy system. You would not do that if there were no repercussions on the environment with the old system. There are, so we need to transform, but this will be costly and will probably be burdensome, more burdensome for some actors than for others. So the idea would be to manage the transition by increasing the scope of this European emission trading system and introducing a uniform price over time, but quite quickly. But now the European Green Deal is entering. And this means that the degree of ambition is increasing. So far, taking the first steps is somewhat difficult because it means to leave a regime of policy regime and move into another one. But taking the first steps in terms of harvesting the low fruits is easy. But now it will become more costly because higher ambitions mean the very last ton of emissions avoided will always be a little bit more expensive, more difficult to achieve. Otherwise, it would have been realized before. So that means that we now need to think about what is really, from an economic perspective, an overall perspective on economic prosperity, what is the right approach? Well, of course, it needs to be one which is working effectively towards the objective of climate neutrality. It also needs to be efficient in the sense of needing as little economic resources along the way as possible. This would be the idea of uniform carbon pricing, but we are not finished yet. There are several requirements that are to be fulfilled in order to make that work and really be guided and carried by the acceptance of the public, of voters in our democracies. The general public needs to be going along with this solution and not objecting it. One is we need to take care of the distributional consequences at the national level. At the national levels, which is a difficult political issue. Let's not talk about it too long, but it's clear that prices make transparent how costly this transformation will be. But prices are the messengers of this insight. They are not the causes of this. So because usually low-income households use more of their budgets for energy services, they will be they will realize a larger burden by an energy transition, but than higher households relative to their income. So we need to take care of that at the national levels. National level, because distributional issues, social policy issues are typically also within Europe a national prerogative and a national responsibility. But also we need to take care of competitiveness and of carbon leakage. It doesn't really help the global climate if we price carbon in Europe very heavily, avoid emissions, and those who produce our goods will move to other places in the world where the climate regime is less stringent, producing there, and we re-import to Europe the carbon content within the products being produced. Nothing has changed for the climate, just economic prosperity in Europe has been declining, or would have been declining. This is not a solution. So we need to take care of that. And I will talk about this in the last 5 minutes of my talk. But Let me mention one more thing. We need to also provide incentives for, and that's the topic of our talk today, of our session, of our symposium, for other countries to join a multilateral coordinated solution. The EU has a difficult choice to make here. Should it be a promoter in the sense that it is fulfilling its own objectives and working very hard at the global level, at the international level, of forging climate policy alliances with the US, with China, with other actors? Or should it be a pioneer? Pioneer in the sense it's doing its best to reduce its own emissions and hopes for the best regarding multilateral collaboration. Now, from the way I posed that question, you see how I think about it. I think it needs to be a promoter and work together with others very closely. For example, or for instance, with respect to energy imports, Europe is an energy importing economic region, and it will still be in 30 years' time. Just that the sources of energy need to have changed from fossil sources to renewable sources. So we need a hydrogen strategy. We do have one in Europe and in Germany, but it needs to be filled with life by forging partnerships with potential sending countries. So where the sun, for example, is very, very ample in supply, one could have devices to generate hydrogen and ship it to Europe. All these issues are becoming more pressing with greater ambitions. Now, this is a completely, this is a very intricate discussion, but in a nutshell, it means that everything I told you about the rational climate policy needs to be speeded up, especially we have to now really take care of the question and consider the question how to deal with carbon leakage. Why? Because in the previous times, carbon prices in the ETS, the European emission trading system, were so low, under 30 euros per ton, that it was not really a matter of big concern. But with more climate ambition, prices need to increase. Prices or shadow prices, in the sense that if you don't show the true costs by pricing carbon, but rather implement command and control strategies, there is an implicit cost. You can express it in a shadow price for carbon, and it will, both the pricing and the shadow prices and the shadow prices will increase steeply according to the climate ambitions. So we need to prevent carbon leakage. How do we do that? Well, a very prominent discussion in Europe in the moment is border carbon adjustments. With perfect information, that would be a very good solution. You take every product that is imported to Europe, look at its carbon content, and implement a pricing, a tax on this, or require emission trading certificates to the extent that carbon is embodied in this product. This seems at the surface a very, very straightforward and a very promising solution, because it announces also income, revenue, maybe for the use of policy making within Europe for infrastructure development and so forth. But there are many intricate issues to be solved. First of all, it's a technical challenge to exactly measure carbon content in these products. But I think, and that's my last slide, there are more important issues than just the technical implementation of border carbon adjustments. We need to consider, European policymakers will need to consider who is and who is not pursuing an equivalent climate policy. Well, if shadow prices or carbon prices of similar magnitude are implemented in different parts of the world, of course, you would not really need a border carbon adjustments scheme, but you would definitely have to clarify that that the border carbon adjustment, if you implement it on behalf of the European Union, you cannot really, you should definitely clarify that it's not a device just to protect European industry, but rather a device to protect the global climate. But irrespective of this communication, it is always a challenge to prove, to make the case that it's not a protectionist measure. So the advice by many people that I'm talking to in the Franco-German Council of Economic Experts, in the scene of the European academies of technical sciences and so forth, I think many people would agree to my position that I put on the slide. It should now be the time to take the tailwind created by the new Biden administration in the US to forge an international climate club, carbon club. So not to implement unilaterally on behalf of the EU a border carbon adjustment, but rather find a solution that is working on a more global scale, which of course means you should prepare for implementing a border carbon adjustment. And the first step would be to really effectively introduce a uniform carbon pricing mechanism for all sectors, all relevant sectors in Europe. This would be a way forward, and it needs to be a multilaterally negotiated way. It cannot be a unilateral way because the global problem requires global solutions. Thank you very much.